hundreds of people have been arrested. Cars, businesses, and property were set on fire. This was Turkey over the past week, as anti-Syria riots broke out after reports that a Syrian man sexually assaulted a little girl. But it's part of a much wider story. On the surface, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan making the most direct statements yet that he's willing to reinstate ties with Syria's Bashar Al Assad in what would be a breakthrough after more than a decade of no diplomatic ties between the two. But this shift in tone is a far cry from where things normally stand. After Syria's 2011 uprisings fueled a civil war that rages on till today, asylum seekers escaping the violence and crackdowns at home were welcomed into neighboring countries, including Turkey, which is now home to more than 3 million Syrian refugees. Since then, Assad has been politically ostracized, not just in Turkey, but by much of the international community for his stance. Erdogan's warmer tone, however, comes amid growing anger and discontent by Turks themselves towards Syrians to a degree that some would even describe as xenophobic. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This week, we look at the impact of the brewing anger against refugees in Turkey and the evolving political landscape between Ankara and Damascus. To better understand the events of this past week, I am joined now by Lizzie Porter, the nationalist correspondent in Istanbul. Lizzie, the riots that first erupted in Kayseri spread significantly and became rather violent. How did things get so out of hand? What happened exactly?
So at the beginning of last week, a Syrian man in the city of Kayseri in central Turkey was accused of sexually assaulting a minor, also a Syrian. This was kind of a spark for growing anti-Syrian sentiment in Turkey to grow. It was a sort of reason or a justification for Turks who are frustrated and angry about many of their own problems, economic conditions, social conditions in Turkey, and to find an outlet for that. And unfortunately, Syrians bore the brunt of that. So the riots started in Kayseri. There was burning of shops and businesses, attacks on Syrians. And these spread to other cities where there are lots of Syrians. So places like Gaziantep, which is in the southeast of Turkey, near the Syrian border. The city of Antalya, a Syrian boy was killed in Antalya. There were many, many other examples of this across the country. This is unfortunately not the first time, but lots of observers have pointed out that this wasn't sort of isolated in one place. It grew across the country. It also sparked a reaction within Syria on Turkish interests in Syria. That was also because there has been talk in recent weeks about normalization between Assad in Damascus and President Erdogan, who've been estranged for over a decade now because of the war in Syria. But in recent weeks, the Turkish president has been making signs or giving hints that he would welcome some kind of normalization with Assad. He has publicly said he would invite Assad to come to Turkey, but that also sparked anger in those in the Turkish supported areas of Syria that, they don't want this to happen. They are vehemently opposed to Assad and they do not want to see that happening.
Lizzie, Erdogan's statement didn't come out of the blue. Iraq has expressed willingness to mediate normalization efforts between Turkey and Syria. So why this push now? What's Russia's role at all? And what are the sticking points for talks and for full-blown normalization to happen?
Turkish officials have met with Syrian, Russian, and Iranian officials, but not at a presidential level. I think Erdogan particularly wants Russia involved because Turkey and Russia have a very close relationship in terms of energy imports, in terms of tourism, and Erdogan has been wanting to get Putin to come to visit Turkey for a long time. Iraq has also been very cooperative in Turkey's eyes recently on the issues that Turkey sees as its main priorities when it comes to Syria and Iraq, which is the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is a group, a separatist Kurdish organization that's deemed a terrorist organization by Ankara and also by some other countries. So Iraq has been more cooperative on the PKK, and I think therefore has kind of shown itself as someone that Turkey can work with, and therefore potentially a partner or a mediator on the issue of Syria as well, because it would also be in Iraq's interest economically to have normalization with Syria in terms of trade ties. Also, Erdogan's political opposition has always said, we want to improve ties with Damascus. And I think now Erdogan is seeing this political opposition and having to kind of take into account some of their positions potentially, and to ease this kind of great domestic malaise that there is about Syrian refugees, who are unfairly blamed for many of Turkey's problems economically, socially, in terms of crime and social change. They're a sort of scapegoat in that sense. Some Syrians have gone back to northwest Syria since he made those remarks, which the Turks insist are voluntary. But human rights observers say that it's not always clear that people want to go back.
In the aftermath of last week's riots, there was also a massive data leak of the identities of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Syrians inside Turkey. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, this was a strange incident confirmed by Turkey's Interior Ministry. Last week, some Telegram accounts started publishing data from Turkey's migration management authorities of Syrians. Syrians have to be registered, and they have to have their addresses and personal data registered with the government in order to receive some EU-funded benefits in Turkey. And this data was leaked online. The Interior Ministry said that they arrested a 14-year-old in connection with the leak, and it's not clear who exactly was behind it. It's also not clear if the data was new or whether it was already available online. Regardless of whether it was an entirely brand new leak or not, the idea of bringing up Syrians' personal data into the public sphere again was intended by whoever leaked it to create fear. You know, your data isn't safe. We know where you are. Human rights observers I was talking to were saying, this could lead to Syrians being implicated in crimes or events that they have no connection to, and therefore creating justification for, potential deportation or something like that. But it was definitely a way to create fear amongst Syrians at a time in which they've already been attacked widely and are facing lots of racism in Turkey.
Whether Turkey and Syria will actually normalize ties after 13 years is still a big question mark. I've asked Dr. Serhat Çubukçuoğlu, senior researcher at Trends Research and Advisory in Abu Dhabi, what it would take for Erdogan to put words into action.
The critical factor here is Russia, because it's the party that behind the scenes tries to pull together the strings and brings them on around the same table. Why it does that? Because it wants to protect its interests in both countries. It's heavily invested in both Syria and Turkey and acts as like partially a broker to both sides. Most of the critics blame Erdogan's personal intransigence and animosity towards Bashar Al Assad for the issue of non-negotiation or the breakdown of diplomatic relations and the lack of any sort of contact with the Syrian government. They blame him for his personal animosity toward Bashar al-Assad and the failure of Turkey midway through the war to actually realize what it had set to achieve, which was to topple Bashar al-Assad. And to overcome these critics, Erdogan is so now outspoken and seemingly keen to come to terms with Bashar al-Assad, but whether he actually means it, whether he believes that Bashar al-Assad can return the favor and take the hand that he extends to come meet with Erdogan in a third country or maybe even in Turkey, I'm not so sure. Even if he does, whether that will bear any results, there is no certainty around whether the Syrian regime, Damascus, has the power, the capabilities, the outreach to actually consolidate these territories and be able to meet Turkey's conditions, which is to secure the country's northern border and come to where we were before, 14 years ago. Whether Bashar al-Assad is able to achieve that without Russia's approval, without having come to terms with the US, which is the big elephant in the room there, as you know. So how will that happen? What are the mechanisms through which Turkey's request or Bashar al Assad's expectations from Turkey can be met, which is mainly withdrawal of Turkish troops from the north? But how will that happen without having met some sort of a security arrangement or come to an agreement with all the parties involved? How can Bashar al Assad guarantee Turkey that as the head of the state, he can achieve that? And I don't think there is any way he can right at this moment. So even if he meets with Erdogan, I think the aim is to have a photo op, to appear of having shaken hands, and for Erdogan to both satisfy his domestic interlocutors and his foreign partners that, look, I'm on the same ground as you. Syria has been accepted into the Arab League, and I'm here to make peace with them, but only on the conditions that we have stated before and so forth. So he's playing the ball game.
We've seen Erdogan make similar claims during the presidential elections last year, using that political card yet again to distract from other issues at home, but nothing really ever materialized. What makes this time different?
Yeah, I mean, there are several sticky points. I mean, one is certainly the issue of immigrants or the temporary residents in Turkey that have, migrated in mass after the start of the civil war, and the negative reaction that has arisen among the Turkish public toward the prolonged presence of groups in Turkey that some people perceive as a threat to the social fabric or the future of Turkish society as a unified sort of nationalist bloc. And the government has come to an understanding that it's kind of nearing a boiling point now. This is maybe partly why Erdogan has made such an opening to quell these protests at home or to sort of calm them down, saying, yes, look, we are trying, we do our best. We're near the point of, actually reaching a moment of handshake with Assad, Bashar al-Assad, and it may pave the way toward the return of at least some of the immigrants in the country. So don't worry, we are on it. So this may be the message Erdogan wants to give and sort of take hold of the ground it lost during the elections, regain it.
Which also brings us to the next point, which is, will Syrians going back to Syria actually feel safe, living and operating and working in areas that are controlled by Damascus, the very government that they opposed 13 years ago? That's the question.
And I think the answer is no. And whether Bashar al-Assad actually wants them back is also a no. I don't think he's genuine in, asking for people who have left the country to actually return. He's very happy that they have left because as a minority government, he has a firmer base, a higher chance of actually staying in power with whatever he has under control right now, instead of having to deal with all these people coming back and the massive task of actually having to rebuild the country. But he's nowhere near there. We're not even mentioning the possibility of the return of refugees that have left the country. So how will they be reintegrated into the society, let alone the security framework that they will be provided with, what the Syrian regime forces are going to do, whether they will capture the lost territories or whether they will just sit where they are. Where will these people, the returning immigrants, be placed? These are all big unknowns. So I think in this context, just Erdogan saying, yes, he will invite Assad to a meeting and have a photo op with Putin in the same room. It is symbolically important, but after all this destruction and what has happened to people and the places they've left, it's a long walk. I mean, it's a big task to turn the wave around and come to terms with whatever has happened.
Syria today continues to be a battleground as it fights for a stronger position globally as well. More than a decade of fighting, violence, sectarianism, and political tensions have created deep-rooted divides. Humanitarian organizations and human rights groups warn that it's not yet safe for refugees to return. So what do recent events mean for Syria's refugee community in Turkey? Syria analyst and researcher Sam Heller spoke to me about these developments and their potential consequences. Sam, from Syria's regime's point of view, what would be the advantage of normalizing ties with Turkey? And is there a push by the Syrian regime itself to actually make that happen, or are we just in a kind of cycle of talks that are not going anywhere?
I think that Damascus has a lot to gain from normalizing relations with Ankara. I think that what seemed to be top of the agenda has been the withdrawal of Turkish forces from northwest Syria, Related to that would, I think, be an end to Turkish support for Syrian opposition groups. And then the kind of the protection that Turkey has provided for remaining opposition militants in the country's north.
Syria calls these troops' presence an infringement on its sovereignty. What will it take for Turkey to actually withdraw its troops, and how likely are the sticking points between the two nations going to dissolve? Are we just in some sort of cycle of discussions that are not heading anywhere?
Yeah, I'm not particularly bullish on prospects for normalization this time. I think that the view from the Syrian side has been that the Turks are trying to have things both ways, that they want the normalization of ties, and then they want some of the domestic political gains that would accrue from that without actually having to end Turkey's occupation of North Syria. And I think the Syrians are not willing to countenance that. Obviously, they still accuse Turkey of occupying and then illegally annexing Lüwe Iskenderun or Hatay. All these years later, I think they are suspicious of Turkish intentions and the possibility of kind of just a lasting Turkish occupation of large sections of North Syria and dislike of this Turkish government in Damascus.
Is it even practical for Syrians to be returning home back to Syria? Do they even want to? Aren't they afraid of retaliation or consequences by the government that they were opposing 13 years ago? Many of them have already built lives in Turkey over the past 13 years and have become very integrated into society. So how practical is it to be even discussing the prospect of returning 1 million plus refugees from Turkey into Syria?
So return on that scale does not seem practical. I think that it seems like it's more just a rhetoric for domestic Turkish political consumption. But no, I don't think that large numbers of refugees will return, certainly willingly. What seems to be the case is that return to opposition-controlled areas in Syria's north, that those areas are not safe. The future of those areas, who will remain in control politically, militarily, is very much in question. Doesn't seem like there is capacity economically in these areas to absorb large numbers of Syrian returnees. And then if we look at areas of Syrian government control, I think that for large numbers of Syrians who are now outside the country, they have, I think, justified fears for their safety on their return to these areas. It seems likely impossible for anyone other than those refugees themselves to judge the real safety concerns that they face, the possibility of detention.
And you don't anticipate that any talks of normalization with Turkey would entail promises by the Assad regime to ensure the safety of returnees?
I think that promises to that effect made bilaterally between Syria and Turkey, I think it's hard for me to imagine those either being made or being like a solid, credible basis for returns. Damascus has been taking some steps, I think not with an eye on Turkey necessarily, but they have been making some moves over the last few years and lately in conversation with UNHCR to address some of the safety concerns that returnees would face back in Syria. But obviously, there are these kind of safety and security obstacles to returns to Syria, but then there's also like a set of real and challenging, more kind of material economic obstacles related to just the dire economic state of the country, the lack of livelihoods for returned refugees, the absence of functioning public services, all of which I think are additional barriers to returns. I think that it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a mindset change among the international community, and it's not going to permit the type of large-scale return that Turkish politicians are offering their domestic public.
That's it from Beyond the Headlines. For more on this developing story, head to thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and Arthur Edison, and I'm your host, Nada Al Tahir.